So, how many of you had some bitters at lunch? Sorry, all of those of you who are live streaming. Anybody notice that their digestion seemed better after having bitters? Shout out anything you notice. Anybody feel worse? Worse? Better? Okay. Anybody take the digestive enzyme? Did you do all three at once? Okay. Really hard to tell what was going on then, huh? Okay. So today in this lecture, I'm going to talk about digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid, betaine HCl, a little bit about bile and bile secretions, and did anybody take the betaine HCl and notice that it made them feel worse in any way? Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Typically, if you take betaine HCl and you don't need it, sometimes you feel worse because it just gave you extra stomach acid. So sometimes people feel like a little bit of heartburn or a little bit of warmth in their tummy in their stomach that's not usually there. So nobody noticed that, so we'll talk about that too. Aha. How come these are different? Anyway, so in this, I just told you what I'm going to talk about, and we're going to focus again on kind of this process of digestion and keep moving through. So we went through food choices, we went through vagal nerve function and cephalic phase of digestion. We talked a little bit about motility very quickly. And now we're going to go into digestion and absorption, and I'm going to spend a lot of time there. Saliva. Did you ever really think about what's in saliva and what it might do for you? You know, it's great for lubrication. It's good for kissing. It's good for lots of different things. And it does make our food digestible and for us to be able to swallow it. But when you look at it, it's got antimicrobial properties. It helps remineralize the dentin on your teeth. For digestion, it has amylase, RNase, protease, lipase. So the beginning of digestion starts in your mouth. Have you ever had an artichoke and you notice how sweet your mouth tastes? Because it's the amylase is starting to get broken down right as you're eating that artichoke. It also buffers. There's all kinds of minerals in there to keep it buffered so that it's neutral. Because if it's really acidic, it's going to start demineralizing your teeth. It helps with taste. It's antiviral properties. And so chewing and swallowing is very important. And Jerry talked a little bit about stomach acid, and we secrete about 2 liters a day of stomach acid, and that acid is comprised of hydrochloric acid, water, and some electrolytes, and a little bit of proteins and mucus, and then pepsin, which helps us to start cleaving proteins. And the gastric acid, we are so concerned in our culture about people who have too much acid, but sometimes people actually have low stomach acid, and that is more apparent when people are under lots of stress and when people are aging. So I think Jerry talked about this, but proteins are so interesting. When we eat a protein, it can be up to 20,000 amino acids long. So the pepsin and the gastric acid in our stomach starts cleaving these proteins so that we don't have to work so hard in the small intestine to really be able to digest them fully and break them down into usable peptides. Also, the stomach acid is critical for absorption of minerals. When when you recommend somebody take iron, do you ever recommend that they take it with tomato juice or orange juice? You do that because, why? Because the acid helps with the absorption of calcium, iron, magnesium, zinc, and so many other minerals. And that happens in the duodenum, which is that first 12 to 18 inches of the small intestine. So if you don't have enough stomach acid, you're not going to have good mineral absorption. And we see that in people who have been taking PPIs long term. We're starting to see the papers that indicate, indeed, they have mineral insufficiencies in certain cases. The other thing that this stomach acid is so important for is to actually catch fungi, bacteria, parasites, and other kind of off proteins like, bad meat or whatever, to just catch all of those and start digesting them so that they don't actually get into our digestive system intact. And so it protects us against food poisoning and also from getting yeast overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth. The stomach acid is so important that we have it there. So why do people get low stomach acid? As I said, stress. I remember for a while I was working with all these like 20-somethings working in New York City, working 80 hours a week. And they all had low stomach acid because they were so stressed out. When you think about making hydrochloric acid, it's produced by the parietal cells as is intrinsic factor that couples with B12 so that we can absorb the vitamin B12. But the intrinsic factor also makes this hydrochloric acid for gastric acid. And if you think about how expensive that is to make, because most of the cells, most of the liquids and fluids in our body are at a pH that's pretty neutral. And now we're going to make this acid that's a pH of 1 to 2. It takes a lot of energy to do that. And so in somebody who's really stressed out, it's like, don't have time to do that. That takes too much time, costs too much money, not happening. And in people who are elderly or debilitated or who are frail and have had kind of long-term chronic health issues, they might not be able to do that. People who fast all the time may not also build enough gastric acid. H. pylori just destroys acid. So I think Jerry's going to be talking about H. pylori later. And of course, PPIs and acid blockers of any sort, they diminish our acid, and then we can't absorb our minerals, and we open ourselves to all kinds of things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, iron deficiency, iron and other mineral deficiencies. We open ourselves to H. pylori infection, which if we get H. pylori, then the H. pylori can also make us more hypochlorhydric. So you start thinking about that and going, okay, without this acid as a protective barrier in the stomach, we're not doing well. And I remember a long time ago, I was working with this, she was a young woman, maybe 22 years old, and she came to see me, and I wasn't much older at the time. And she had started taking, she was starting to have a lot of acid burning, a lot of heartburn, and she'd gone on this really bland diet, like white toast, white rice, as bland as she could go, and she was still having all this acid burn. And so I said, let's just do an experiment. Let's just try a little bit of betaine HCl and just take it with a meal that you have some protein in, and let's just see how you feel. And she took like one, and then the next meal she took two. She's like, heartburn completely gone. And we usually think about heartburn as too much acid, but what I learned from Dr. Jonathan Wright is that it's not too much acid, it's acid in the wrong place. Your acid belongs in your stomach, but when that acid backs up into your esophagus, the esophagus doesn't have that mucous membrane, that coating that protects it. And that's when we start getting esophagitis and we start having the problems from the acid. I think I talked about all those things. Oh, and then B12 insufficiency is indirect because remember I said the parietal cells make intrinsic factor that allow us to actually absorb vitamin B12. And so if there's something going wrong with the intrinsic, with the parietal cells, like parietal cell antibodies that are autoimmune disease of the parietal cells, then you're not going to be able to make intrinsic factor. You'll be vitamin B12 insufficient and also gastric acid insufficient. So some of the signs that you might notice when somebody is hydrochloric or gastric acid insufficient is they'll tell you they burp all the time. Or when every time they eat something with protein, it feels like it just sits in their stomach for hours and hours and hours. And it's really interesting because I've had people say, oh, every time I eat beef, it sits there like a lump, but chicken and fish are fine. Or I cannot eat beef, I can only eat beef, but I can't eat chicken and fish. You know, we're so individual in terms of like what our feelings are. But if you're working with somebody and they're vegetarian or vegan, one of the good questions to ask them is this some philosophical thing, or is it because you really don't feel well when you eat any animal protein? And if you don't feel like you can digest the animal protein, maybe it's because you don't have enough, as Patrick called it, agni or fire or acid in the belly. Sometimes, so those are the two most common things that I see when people have low acid, is this burping and they feel like their food doesn't digest well. But it can also show up as just kind of gas, bloating, indigestion, GERD, constipation. You know, the digestive system doesn't have that many ways to respond to its displeasure. So we see the same kind of symptoms over and over and over. And this comes from doctors Joe Pizzorno and Michael Murray. Low gastric acid is associated with a lot of different health conditions. And you can think about it, well, if you're not breaking down protein well, and you're also not absorbing minerals well, and you're opening yourself up to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, parasites, and fungi, well, you can see why it would be associated with a lot of problems. Now, over the last many times that we have taught this course, we haven't included this piece. And last year, Patrick and I started talking about it in the Q&A sessions. And we think this is a really kind of easy, down and dirty way to test for stomach acid sufficiency. Basically, when you get up in the morning, you take 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda and you put it in 1/2 cup of water or 100 grams of water, and you just drink it. And then you don't tell anybody, like if you're doing this with your patients, recommending it, don't tell them what you're looking for. Just ask them to note what they notice over the next 5 to 10 minutes and let you know what that is. And what ought to happen is that they ought to start burping. And the reason is when you put baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate, and you put that together with hydrochloric acid, it should cause carbon dioxide gas, which should come up as a burp. So we don't have any research on this, but more and more clinicians are starting to use this. And people generally have baking soda in their homes. It's something easy that they can do. And it's something simple that doesn't cost a lot of money. Oh, and remember to tell everybody in the post webinars, we're going to have a series where you're going to be trying these things on yourselves and reporting on what you notice. Because the best way to implement something in your own practice is to be your own guinea pig. I have done so many tests on myself and tried so many herbs and supplements. just to try to see what they feel like. If we can't do these things, then how can we ask other people to do them? Now, the test that we've used a lot more often is we've used the betaine HCl, which you took at lunch, and pretty much what happens is that you either ought to notice that in somebody who has a lot of gastric acid, empirically what we see is that if they take more acid, then they feel worse. And I've had clients tell me different things. They've said, oh, I felt like I had horrible heartburn. It felt like a burning in my stomach. One person said, my neck started really hurting and feeling hot. Somebody else got a headache. Other people have told me that they've gotten diarrhea. So any negative sign that is just out of the norm for you, I would say experiment over, okay? Because that probably means you have enough betaine HCl, enough acid in your stomach, and you don't need more. If you don't notice anything going on and you feel nothing, which most of you in this room noticed nothing when you took it, then what you can try doing is taking 2 with a meal that has protein for the next time, and then maybe 3, and you can go up to about maybe 2,500, 3,000 milligrams of betaine HCl, and just see how you feel. And for many people, what they find is that taking betaine HCl, their heartburn goes away, they have more energy, they just feel so much better taking it. However, I had one client I was working with, and she decided that it was kind of expensive to take like 3 at every meal, so she just started taking 8 at one meal. And then she calls me and she goes, oh yeah, well, all I had was cereal and milk, and I took 8 betaine HCl. And I'm like, no, you're not supposed to do that because it is acid and it will burn a hole in your stomach. I had another woman who came to see me just one time, her friend, who I'm going to give you a case on, she was like, oh, my friend, she started taking betaine HCl. She felt so much better. I think I'd like to try it. And she came in with her husband, and they were newly married. And she called me about maybe 3 months later, and she said, I'm in the emergency room because I have ulcers in my stomach, and could it be the calcium I'm taking? And I'm like, how much betaine HCl were you taking? She was like, more was better. And what I didn't know was she was also not really eating because she was in a new marriage, and her husband was always on her about how fat she was, even though she was really thin. So she wasn't eating much. So she was anorexic and hyperloading on these. And I'm really glad that they liked me and they did not sue me. But it's not how I recommended that she take them in the first place. So, we've kind of, so you want to be careful using these. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with in the past who really find that taking, 1 or 2 with a meal with a lot of protein really makes their life so much better. So I'm not saying don't use betaine HCl, but I am saying be cautious with it. And if you know somebody has a stomach ulcer or they have active ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, you probably don't want to use this. The other thing that I want to just kind of tell you about is we were in Atlanta doing this GI module years ago, and there was a physician there, and he had a Heidelberg capsule test. And he basically said, oh, I've been doing the betaine HCl test and then also doing the Heidelberg capsule test, and there's no correlation. So I want you to know, this is a down and dirty test. We have no research on it, but we found it to be clinically useful. When we first sat down to create this module, and when we continuously do that, we're always having these conversations. What are we doing now? What's changed? What do we find that's useful? What do you think about these lab markers? What do you think about this? Because we're always trying to figure it out. So sometimes empirically things work, even though we're not exactly in sync with maybe a better test. So how else, if you don't want to mess around with betaine HCl, what else can you use? And I like to use umeboshi plums, and I also like to use those bitters that some of you had at lunch. I saw there were still some out there, so you maybe had some with a snack or something too. Bitters have been used for centuries in European medicine to stimulate the production of bile and to promote better digestion. And typically, they also have antimicrobial herbs in them that kill microbes, yeast and bacteria. You can also use diluted vinegar. Start with maybe like a tablespoon of vinegar and 8 ounces of water, and then just kind of increase the amount based on what tastes good and what feels good. And then that vagus nerve, things that de-stress us. So anything that makes you feel really great, acupuncture, meditation, yoga, walks in nature. I use my garden for that. All these things are good for you. So here's some things that are typically in bitters. Gentian, which is antimicrobial on all levels. Ginger, wormwood, angelica, cinnamon, rhubarb, myrrh, orange peel, fennel, ginger, dandelion. And as I said, it's been used for centuries to stimulate the production of enzymes and hydrochloric acid and bile. And it's also very soothing. And again, we don't have a lot of research on bitters, but because of the ingredients in them, they do help kind of protect us in the way that hydrochloric acid does from infection. And these are umi plums. Have any of you ever had umi plums? They don't really taste like plums. They're actually an apricot, and they're salted and pickled, and they're really intense. But we have some really good research on their health benefits. And I've found that with people with a lot of heartburn, it seems like it really calms it down, and found them to be really useful. How many of you personally take digestive enzymes? How many of you recommend them to your patients? Great. Speaking to the choir. So the main digestive enzymes are lipases that break down fat, amylases that break down starches and carbohydrates, and proteases that break down proteins. And we've got different ones, like I talked about salivary amylase, but we also have salivary lipase and protease as well. And different enzymes are released in different parts of the digestive tract and break down these different macronutrients. We're finding that more and more people have exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, and Jerry went over the using pancreatic elastase or fecal elastase measures to see if people have enough pancreatic enzyme function. And what's interesting about people who have pancreatic exocrine insufficiency, as you can see from the slide, it looks just like IBS. It looks just like SIBO, and it looks just like fat malabsorption. So unless you actually do the testing or give people enzymes, you're not really going to know what to do about it. And here are other common signs that we see is abdominal pain, weight loss, muscle wasting. Like if you can't utilize your nutrients and you can't break down fats, carbohydrates, and proteins well, you can pretty much get almost any issue. And here's some diseases that are associated. We think about cystic fibrosis as kind of the classic disease that you would use pancreatic enzymes for. But not every person who has cystic fibrosis really needs them, because some of the rare people who don't have enzyme insufficiencies really thrive without taking any enzymes and do much better with cystic fibrosis. So again, making sure doing those tests that Jerry was talking about to really determine, does somebody need these? Something that's not on here is that people with chronic pancreatitis and also pancreatic cancer, they find that they feel so much better when they take pancreatin. And those are in the recommendations for those diseases as well. So what contributes to enzyme deficiency? I think Jerry really talked about this. Those damaged microvilli. If you don't have, if you've got damage, you're not going to secrete the cholecystokinin. The pancreas isn't going to get the message that you just ate and you need to have more enzymes, and it's not going to dump them. Toxicity, stress, nutritional imbalances, imbalanced pH, inhibitors in food like trypsin inhibitors and tannins and things like that, free radicals, and alcohol abuse. I think Jerry talked about those. And then we have other common enzyme insufficiencies, and Jerry talked about some of these. Lactose intolerance is, thought to be apparent in about 70% of the world's population. And there are some populations, like people who live in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, they seem to retain their lactase enzyme activity better. A long time ago, I read a paper in Lifestyle Medicine, and they were talking about dysbiosis and impaired microvilli as a reason why so many of us actually have lactose intolerance. So have you experienced with yourself, or maybe you've experienced with some of your patients, that as you heal the gut and you get the dysbiosis and balance, that people become more lactose tolerant? And again, these disaccharides, lactase is secreted at the tippy top of those microvilli. So if there's any damage to that barrier, to those microvilli, then you're not going to be able to make the lactase and to be able to process it. Fructose intolerance is, Jerry did talk about sucrose intolerance, and breath testing you can do for all of these. But fructose intolerance interests me quite a lot. Hereditary fructose intolerance is very rare, 1 in 20 to 30,000 people, but up to a third of us are fructose intolerant. And why is that? Because in the United States, we're eating almost 40 pounds of high fructose corn syrup a year, and we're loading our diets with fresh fruit and canned fruit and things that have fructose in them. So we're just overloading, and it's just so much that we can't handle it. And so we've got these acquired fructose intolerances, and what it looks like, the symptoms are gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, alternating constipation and diarrhea. So this sounds like IBS or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But the treatment is really simple. Take fructose out of somebody's diet and see how they do. And so often somebody will come into your office and go, if I have a soft drink, I feel terrible. Or if I eat a piece of fruit, I get gassy and bloated. And it's like, you just told me what the answer is. Let's just see if you're fructose intolerant. Maybe you've just been eating so much that you're over your capacity. Also, when they looked at fructose intolerance in people with Crohn's, 61% had fructose intolerance, 42% had lactose intolerance, and 29% have both. So in Crohn's disease, you really want to look for these enzyme insufficiencies. In ulcerative colitis, we see a lot of lactose malabsorption, and in celiac disease, you don't really see much of this. So how do we support enzyme function? So again, vagal nerve function, chewing your food really well. I remember a long time ago reading John Robbins' book, May All Be Fed, and he talked about people who were in a concentration camp, and because they had so little food to eat, some of them decided that they were going to chew their food really well, each bite. And the survival rate of the people who were chewing their food really well was vastly larger than the people who were just eating their food normally. Chew your food. I don't think you have to chew every bite and count that, but make sure that your food is really liquidy before you swallow it, and don't wash it down with liquid. If you need to wash it down, you didn't chew it well enough. Your food choices can support it, and also enzymes. So I wish we had more research on the role of herbs and spices in secreting digestive enzymes. Most of the work comes out of India, and so we see mostly Indian herbs. So ginger and turmeric upregulated pancreatic amylase. Turmeric upregulated lipase activity by 80%. By 80%, and we're using pancreatic enzymes to do that. But what if you just had people putting turmeric in their morning smoothies, or adding turmeric, fresh turmeric or powdered turmeric to their food when they were cooking? Really easy way to get that kind of fat digestion moving. And then to break down disaccharides, coriander and onion, and at least one disaccharide, ginger, ajwain, fennel, cumin, asafoetida, again, turmeric, red pepper, and black pepper. And then we had one American study that said, yes, mint and fennel will increase bile secretion and lipase and amylase secretion. So I wish we had more on like oregano and basil and thyme and other everyday herbs and spices that we use. But this is enough to tell me, why don't we be cooking with more of these? Because it enhances digestion, which we've known for millennium, that when you add herbs and spices, they act as carminatives, they enhance digestion. And also, there's lots of enzymes in food. So one thing I didn't make today, but if I had taken some cucumber pickles and put them in a jar with a saltwater brine, and then kind of loosely covered them for a few days, they would ferment, and they would turn into pickles. And the reason that they do that is because there's microbes and enzymes already in the cucumber. So you don't really have to add anything. So all of our fresh produce, raw foods, culture foods, fermented foods, all enhance our digestive function by upregulating our enzymes. So let's talk about using enzyme products. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so there's lots of different kinds. Any of you using pancreatin in your practices? Okay, I'm just going to kind of talk about all of these different types of enzymes that I like to use. So the most commonly prescribed enzyme product is desiccated and dried pancreatic tissue, usually from a pig. And, we've got Creon and Biocase and lots of different types of these. And they come either just as they are, or they come kind of microencapsulated. And the reason why they come microencapsulated is because these pancreatic enzymes work when you've got food in your stomach and when the pH of your stomach is higher than 4. But when the food moves out and when the food's all been digested, they don't really work very well. And lipase activity specifically just stops. And so the idea is that, they don't work all the time in the acid environment of the stomach. So if you make them time released, then you can get them into the duodenum and the small intestine, and they can work there. So that's the theory, but when I read papers about it, it doesn't really matter whether you use regular pancreatin or microencapsulated pancreatin. The results seem to be about the same. And the doses that are typically used is that you start looking, they're measured by units of lipase, and even though they have proteases and amylases in them, the main reason why these enzymes are used is for steatorrhea and for people who are having problems digesting fat. Yet, they really do help also with protein and carbohydrate as well. So typical doses might be anywhere from, in units of lipase, anywhere from like 16 to 18,000 all the way up to maybe 30,000. And again, in clinical trials where you use lots bigger doses of these enzymes, you don't necessarily get better effects, but sometimes you do. And so that's why they come in all these different measures, because you have to kind of play with them. Every once in a while, taking pancreatic enzymes can be very rough on people's stomachs and they feel way worse. And then there's a few, maybe 35 cases of people getting strictures from taking them, which is very rare considering how often they've been used. So, these are kind of trial and error. The dosage you use, the brand you use, it's not that important. Just try. And I would say start with a less, and then if you're not getting the results, then kind of gently bump up. You can also buy pancreatin in health food stores, or from any of the supplement manufacturers who are here. They have pancreatic enzymes. So there are these prescription enzymes, but there's also ones that are just over the counter. People can buy them on their own, and they work really well. Some have pepsin in them, some are just pancreatin, and they come in different concentrations, just like the prescription ones do. And these are taken with food. They're taken with food and really help. There was a time in my life where I had taken birth control pills, and the birth control pills gave me really bad hypoglycemia and chronic vaginal fungal infections. And I just felt like it was in the 1970s and nobody really knew any of this stuff. And I was thinking, oh, I'm the only person in the world who has this stuff going on. And so I started experimenting with my diet, and I started taking over-the-counter pancreatin. And I took it for about a year, and I found that my symptoms and signs improved a lot. My hypoglycemia improved a lot. And I would really use pancreatin with people who have diabetes, pancreatitis. I would use it with somebody who has hypoglycemia. What we know about glandulars from old research in the 80s is that even though this pancreatin shouldn't end up in my pancreas, about 5 to 10% of it will actually get utilized by my pancreas. Or if you take, desiccated thyroid, some of it goes there. And it's my belief that when we use glandulars, based on the research that I've seen, and empirically, that we actually rebuild those tissues. There are also aspergillus-derived grown enzymes. They're grown on a medium of Aspergillus niger, which is not it's a fungus. So if somebody has mold sensitivities or fungal sensitivities, you may not want to use these. But what's brilliant about them is that they work at every pH, from the pH of the stomach of 1 to 2 all the way through the digestive tract. And when I was in practice, I used these quite a lot. And you can see every company makes their own different kind of blend of all of these. We also have lactase enzymes, and again, 3 different products. I just wanted to show you how it's the Wild West out there. And even the naming of them. Protease is measured in BCU. Lactase is measured in FCC. Bromelain is measured in GDU. Like, there's no standardization of these measures or the names of them or anything else. But lactase, for somebody who is lactose intolerant, taking lactase enzymes can really broaden what they're able to eat, because they can eat foods that have dairy products in them and still function pretty well. And so if that's just the only problem, then why not support that? And so a lot of times people might not eat dairy products in their home, but when they go out to eat, they might have some lactase enzymes just in case. Now, gluten support enzymes. Just a couple weeks ago, and we were all talking about this in one of our meetings, we saw some big marketing from one of the supplement companies saying, absolutely, our gluten enzymes can break down gluten and gliadin, and so everybody can now eat gluten-containing grains. And we're all like, wait a minute, let's look at the research this is based on. And it doesn't say that. Okay? It just doesn't say that. And I'm hoping that someday we might have enzymes that are good enough for people with celiac that they might be able to eat occasionally some gluten-containing grains. But we don't have them yet. What I like to use these enzymes for is in people who have wheat intolerance, gluten intolerance, celiac disease, and they come to a conference like this. And they eat in a restaurant, and they're not sure if it was a gluten-free kitchen, or they might get some inadvertent exposure. Or you're going to a restaurant at home or a friend's house, and you're just not 100% sure that everything was absolutely gluten-free. These enzymes are great because they'll help break down little bits of inadvertent gluten, but they will not help you eat a bowl of pasta. Okay? So this is something like if somebody does have gluten issues, I always tell them, keep a couple of these in your pocket, your purse, wherever, so in case you're eating somewhere different, that you know. And you can just kind of take one or two of these as protection. These are, again, just different brands. And then we also have proteolytic enzymes, and I really like proteolytic enzymes that are kind of loaded with mainly protein splitting enzymes, and they're usually taken either to help digest protein in a meal, but also they can be taken to be used between meals as anti-inflammatories and to reduce pain. And we have research out of Germany with athletes and people with arthritis demonstrating that taking proteolytic enzymes between meals can help reduce inflammation and pain. They're also been used to prevent food poisoning, to support the stomach and pancreas. One of the things that I think is really important that they do is they help break down immune complexes, which are complex molecules that are IgG antibodies and the antigens to food and other substances all wrapped up together. And it's those immune complexes that really can cause a lot of problems and symptoms for people. So I like using proteolytic enzymes for those reasons. And here there's just, again, different companies make different products. And so if one doesn't seem to help you that much, try something else. We also have food-derived enzymes from papaya that mainly break down protein. They're proteolytic. Can be taken, again, with food to break down protein in that meal, or on an empty stomach to reduce inflammation. And then bromelain, which comes from the stems of the pineapple, not pineapple itself, will help digest protein as well. Now, there are a couple others that I don't have slides for, but I just want to talk about. If somebody's having trouble breaking down fats in their meals, I might use a digestive enzyme that's lipase loaded. It still has protease and amylase in it, but it's predominantly lipases to help break down fat. If I'm working with somebody who's got a lot of carbohydrate intolerance, I might use an amylase-loaded digestive enzyme because that will help them break down the carbohydrates more effectively. And most digestive enzymes have a combination of lipase, amylase, and protease in them, but different blends can be made to weigh it one way or another. Okay, so now we're going into polling. So get out your phones. Okay, so the scenario is, I don't know what the scenario is. Okay, there it is. Okay, so this patient presents with belching after meals, and the food sits for a long time in his stomach. He's got undigested food in his stools. He's got acne rosacea. What supplements might you recommend to support his digestion? And there aren't any wrong answers. This is a word cloud. Betaine HCl, that's probably where I would start because low betaine HCl has been associated with acne rosacea. Bitters, I probably would think about those too. Multiple, that's probably a vitamin. Betaine HCl, magnesium, umeboshi, zinc, Swedish bitters. So lots of different things okay. So let's go to the next one. Now this person's complaining of bloating and constipation and sees undigested food in his stool. What supplements might be most helpful for this man? Umeboshi plums, apricot bellies, maybe. I don't know. Belly. I don't know what that is. Digestive enzymes, pancreatic enzymes, probiotics. Great. Lots of great ideas there. I would probably start with a general digestive enzyme and see how that works for him, especially with the undigested food in his stool. And I might try some probiotics and probably also bloating and constipation, maybe doing a breath test for methane and hydrogen to rule out small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So now let's just take a look at gallstones. Cholecystectomies are rampant in our culture, and as Jerry mentioned, sometimes, not always, but sometimes when people have a cholecystectomy, they don't feel better. They're still having problems, and probably we make about 3/4 of a liter of bile salts every day, and they're secreted from the liver, as Jerry talked about, and they're composed of lecithin, cholesterol, and bilirubin. And, the main function is emulsification of fats, but one of the things that they also do is they pull cholesterol that's not needed. They pull that out of the bloodstream. They also deconjugate, bile also deconjugates hormones. So for example, if a woman has ovulated and she's not pregnant and progesterone and estrogen levels are really high, the bile is where it gets deconjugated. And also, bile pulls chemicals out of our bodies. So it's really important that we have good bile function. And signs are, usually kind of don't digest fats well. Steatorrhea, which is gray or tan-colored frothy diarrhea that smells bad, regular diarrhea, bitter taste in the mouth, nausea, vomiting, queasy, and then we all know that with gallbladder issues, people can have weird referred pain almost anywhere in their abdominal area. So how can we support bile function in somebody who's having trouble breaking down hormones, digesting fats? And one of the first go-tos that I think about is just using ox bile. If I was working with somebody who'd had a cholecystectomy and was having fat digestion issues, I would recommend starting to take 500 to 1,000 milligrams of ox bile anytime they had a meal or snack that had fat in it. Dandelion root is also really great. So when you're weeding your garden, if you have time, take some of those dandelion roots and put them in some vodka and make some tincture. And that would be a really good thing to drink at a regular level. Taurine is also taurine is an amino acid that also stimulates the production of bile, and it's been used for a long time to help regulate bile acid production. And D-limonene, which is lemon or lime oil, which is used also for people with gastroparesis, it can be really helpful. But what I like is to focus on the food. Okay? So coffee. Some of you are probably very happy to hear that coffee helps stimulate the production of bile. Radishes, dandelion, chicory, any bitter greens, artichokes, anything that's bitter in your diet is going to help stimulate the production of bile. So I was talking to somebody at one of the breaks. We are bitter deficient in America, and people need to be eating more bitter foods. We just like sweet foods so much more. I can't imagine why. So here's a case. This is a woman who came to see me. She was 58 years old, and she had a lot of belching and gas, and she said her stomach had been irritated for a very long time. She's got some arthritis in her hands and feet, and she's easily constipated. And she's got osteoporosis, and she took Fosamax for 3 years. She's got a ton of energy. So I started thinking about, like, what are her chief complaints? And it's like, I think because let's just start with the top. Let's just start at the very beginning, because she's got a lot of burping and burping and belching. Let's just start at the top, because she also has osteoporosis and she's got arthritis, and I'm thinking maybe she's not using her minerals very well. So I think, oh, well, maybe we should start thinking about hydrochloric acid. So her family history, Alzheimer's disease runs through her family. Her mom has diverticulitis. She's taking Valtrex for herpes prevention. And I mentioned the Fosamax, which we know can cause stomach irritation. And she remembers being constipated as a child and being given enemas for those. And as an adult in her 20s, she started taking some aloe vera, and she found that really helped with constipation, which it does. Aloe is kind of amazing, all through the digestive tract. So she said, in the year 2000, I took some echinacea on an empty stomach, and that irritated my stomach. Maybe, but then she started taking Tagamet, and she did that for 30 days, and now she's got food sensitivities. And then she said, in June, I took a big amount of ascorbic acid, and I got more irritation. So mediators, she's got a stressful job. She loves sugar. She eats it all the time. And she loves wine. She drinks 1 or 2 glasses a day. And then her food diary, she kind of starts out pretty well. It's like a smoothie with berries and pea protein and beets and chard and beet leaves and cranberry, blueberry juice and almond milk, spirulina, flax oil, or I have a sweetened breakfast cereal with blueberries, almonds, and almond milk. And then half a ham and cheese sandwich with water. Then a milkshake, then an apple with almond butter with 2 glasses of wine for dinner. And then leftover stir fry, 1/3 of a cup. So you can see, like, she kind of is trying, but she doesn't have it totally together. Am I being nice? Okay. So I'm going to tell her story back to her. Like, you've got some good things that you're doing in your life. You've got a lot of really good energy, but it seems like your stomach is really kind of the soft spot for you, because a lot of things seem to irritate it pretty easily. So and you also have this arthritis, and you've got bone loss, and both of those require a lot of minerals, not just calcium and magnesium, but boron and phosphorus and everything else. And these all require some stomach acid. So I'm wondering, and you're burping all the time, so I'm wondering if maybe you have low stomach acid. So why don't we just try some betaine HCl and see what happens? That's what we did. So we did a self-test experiment with betaine HCl. She comes in 2 weeks. I'm not belching at all, and it seemed to help immediately. I'm having regular and easy bowel movements. At 6 weeks, she's not belching, but she's having some heartburn. So I said, okay, why don't you go see your doc? And go see a gastroenterologist, see about getting an upper GI endoscopy. Let's see what's going on. And then also, I'm just going to order some food sensitivities. I know Patrick said he doesn't like them, but I do. So I'm starting to think down the road, like, well, this didn't help her all the way. What are we missing? Maybe it's intestinal permeability. Maybe it's with her microbiome. I'm probably going to want to look at her diet more carefully, and maybe we'll do an elimination diet. So she comes back at 12 weeks and her endoscopy is negative, but on her food sensitivities, egg yolks and egg whites are kind of off the charts, oysters, lima beans. So she said, well, I don't really eat lima beans. I don't really eat oysters, so that's not a big deal, but I'm going to stop eating eggs. She stopped eating eggs and her GERD resolved. Then she would go out and she had an omelet and she'd get GERD. And she saw it really clearly. So for her, the biggest food culprit was really eggs. At 15 weeks, she says, I have GERD whenever I eat eggs. We discussed using egg replacers, which are usually made of soy, or you can take chia seeds and water, or ground flax seeds, or ground chia seeds and make an egg replacer. And I recommended emulsants like DGL licorice and slippery elm as needed. So over time, we moved her from the betaine HCl to the bitters because I was worried about keeping her on the HCl long term. And that's pretty much where she ended up. And then we started working on other aspects of her health. And we didn't really need to do a full elimination diet with her. She really felt pretty great. But then it's like, okay, now we need to start thinking about your bone health, your arthritis. Maybe we need to do more. So that's kind of where I started with her. And that's kind of where we ended up. And for brevity, like, I kept seeing her for more time and we worked on other things, but this was the piece that was very pertinent for today's talk. So this clinical decision tree, you've got the go-to-it model on the left. Gather the information, gather yourself, take a couple deep breaths before you walk into that room. I was at a conference recently, and a nurse was like, boom, boom, boom. When I knock, I center myself. So use the go-to-it model, use the dig-in model, and use this clinical decision tree. Thanks, everybody.